on to apologies. We have apologies. I'll move that Council accept the apologies of Councillors Hall, Staines and Vandervis. Seconded Councillor Elder. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Okay. Do we have him here? You might want to pull the microphone down. Welcome, Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Dave. Mayor.
Is it raining out here?
No, it's windy and it looks like it could rain soon.
Okay, we'll move on to the next item. I'll move from the Chair that we confirm the agenda move the agenda as published, and that we confirm with the following alteration in regard to Standing Order 2.1, that option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Hawkins, is there any discussion on that? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against?
Aye.
Carried. Couldn't quite hear what that was, but an aye, right, thank you. Not have been surprised if it weren't, but never know. Item 5, excuse me, the declarations of interest. I'll move that we note the elected members' interest register and confirm the proposed management plan for elected members' interests. Seconded Councillor Lord. Is there any discussion on that? Any additions? There's none. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Item 6, I'll move again from the Chair that we confirm the public part of the minutes of the ordinary council meeting held on the 29th of August. Now, I did chair that meeting, I think, yes. That's one I missed. Seconded Councillor Benson-Pope. Any discussion on that? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against?
Aye.
Carried. On to the minutes of the committees. Item 7, Economic Development Committee. Councillor, you'll move. Seconded Councillor Wiley.
Yes.
Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Item 8, Finance and Council Controlled Organisations. Councillor Lord.
I'm willing to move the Council notes, Part A, items 1 to 8, in the public forum of the meeting of the Finance and Council Controlled Organisation Committee held on the 12th of September, and we'll take Part C items in the non-public part of the meeting. Seconder.
Seconded Councillor Wilson. Any discussion on that? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Right, on to the reports. Item 9, the warehouse precinct. We'll get the team up. Welcome, Anna. Welcome, Crystal. So, would you like to preface any questions with an introduction?
Sure, just a brief introduction.
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for having us today. This report is essentially following up from the report that went to the Planning and Environment Committee on the 15th of August. And so during that committee meeting, we put forward a report that presented an update on the community engagement and design development of warehouse precinct upgrades and a plan for packaging together stages 3 and 4 essentially as one final upgrade that's currently funded. And so what was asked of us during that meeting was a final sign-off of the designs, and that's what we're presenting here in this report. What I'd like to draw your attention to is that the main points of the design, the main goals of the design remain the same as what you will have seen on the 15th of August. What we're trying to do is complement the existing energy that's been put into the warehouse precinct from private investment, so complementing those kind of efforts within the community, as has worked really well on Vogel Street. So, for example, we have Distinction Dunedin, we have some significant investment further down on Bond Street as well, and you will have seen that shape up in recent times. Engaging with the heritage in a meaningful yet also open and forward-thinking way, so taking the design that's rooted in the history of the place and the people, but taking it forward. and looking at streets and spaces that have a high place value and are meant to be shared and can adapt to multiple uses and be enjoyed by in a slower way, I suppose, and ensuring everyone's safety. So the feedback that was received very strongly from you all during the Planning and Environment Committee on the 15th of August was to ensure an incorporation of color and to be bold, so to speak, in the shared space design, and also to balance an adequate provision of parking alongside all of the other important considerations. So that's what we've tried to do here.
Thank you. Questions, councillors? Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks very much for this report and the update. Can you elaborate a little bit on what bold colours will be? Like what kind of colours we're looking at?
Oh, right. So being bold and the provision of colours are two separate things in a way. They're kind of interrelated, but in the provision of colours, what we're looking at is a multi-pronged approach in terms of providing some color through the plantings and some color through the street furniture. So, natural kind of wood planks on the benches and a variety of flowering native species of plants, but also looking at incorporating different warm-colored pavers, which we know can be provided in the standard range if requested, to incorporate alongside some of the existing paving material that you'll see in the warehouse precinct that's more of a gray palette. So it's kind of balancing up the two so that we have a consistent approach within the precinct, but also bringing in that color that's been requested of us. And at the same time, in the shared space design on Bond and Water Streets, looking at the provision of color through and that weaving pattern that we discussed at the Planning and Environment Committee meeting, through a resin-based surface, which is a really high-quality tactile surface that's applied straight to the asphalt. And that would be achieved through a series of low-contrast colors in that sense, because we want to ensure the safety of all pedestrians and people with any kind of visual impairment. So the only place in which a high-contrast colors would be used is, say, when the provision of tactile strips or at the edge of a curb, to make sure that there is that safety, that wayfinding availability for all users.
Thanks. And I sort of as a follow-up to that, and I know it's not directly related, we've got the Centre City paving testing going on out here in the Octagon right now, which I think is a really great example of letting the public see it. Would there be a chance potentially that as that progresses, once we choose certain designs and types, that we might then see different colours used out there as well, so the public could see those colours that we are talking about for the pavers, or maybe down a Bogle Street, if not up here?
Yeah, well, that is something that we've talked about, is potentially extending the paving trial, though we haven't confirmed anything yet. But again, the warehouse precinct can also be seen very much as the first stage of Central City Plan upgrades. So what we do there can be a little bit of a trial, if you will, and see how people respond to what we've done and what we can learn when we're working with the Central City Plan upgrades.
Just following up on that question, Crystal, to what extent, I mean, you might use bold colours, maybe at edges, etc. To what extent are those colours fast, and to what extent do they fade over time?
Oh, right. That's a good question. So the resin surfaces do have an admirable lifespan, probably 5 to 10 years for the resin surfaces. That's what we're seeing with the pedestrian crossings down on Clyde Street that we put in last year. And as you will have seen with those, they fade a little bit, but they do hold their color relatively well. And the provision of any of those high contrast areas that would be needed for wayfinding, it would be provided through, for example, a light gray concrete against a darker asphalt with a darker resin surface color applied to it. So even if it faded, that concrete material would still hold its color more or less, so that wouldn't have an effect on that wayfinding. And the provision of tactile strips would be similar to what you'd see around the central city with those bright yellow dots that could be replaced if something were to happen.
Right, thank you. Councillor Lord.
Look, I've just got a question. It's actually more to do with the paving trial. I really like the look of this, and I think it's great. and happy to support it. But my question is the paving out the front here, the trial. One of the questions I have, in future, do we weigh up, like, there's one particular one out there that I really like, and the moment I step onto it, I just know that I'm not going to slip.
Yeah.
And yet, it's the one that already you can see chips on corners where it's been handled, there's been a wee bit snapped off, and it also looks like it would be perhaps harder to clean, or maybe more costly, and I'm just wondering, is there a tension between something that's really good and something that might be more low maintenance? And I'm just wondering, because I really, and I'm not an old person, and I know there's a lot of old people in this town, but it's just one thing that I hate, feeling insecure. Yeah, just wonder if there's any thought on that comment.
Certainly, I can empathise with those feelings. I mean, even being a woman in high heels can make you nervous, especially on a rainy day. So
It make me nervous too.
yeah, look, it's something that the lessons learned from the paving trial can feed into what we do moving forward. So I know Richard and his team are looking closely at the maintenance and monitoring side of things, and we'll weigh that up against what the public say that they prefer, and try to find a happy medium there. And it might be a case of some materials being provided in certain areas. You know, for example, on a hill, the rougher ones might make the most sense. But, you know, perhaps when you have a seating area and a high spillage of greasy materials and that kind of thing, maybe a more honed finish and a darker tone would be better. So, yeah.
There was an interesting discussion with some of the transport staff around the trial. The very small stones that are currently the two lots in front of the cathedral, my assumption is that they would be both more expensive to lay and more expensive to upkeep. Whilst they are trickier to lay, getting those lines exactly right is harder and takes a bit longer. Once they're in, the transport guys were saying they last considerably longer because people's feet cross 2 or 3 tiles and they tend to settle in a lot more evenly and consistency. They don't end up tipping, and it's the tipping that means constant lifting out, taking out some sand and rebedding. And so they were saying the ongoing maintenance requirements for those small ones that look like cobbles are in fact a lot easier, but they have other downsides. So it will be interesting. It's kind of hard to get all of that information across to the public when you're doing a trial.
Councillor Benson-Pope. Sorry? Oh, right. Councillor Hawkins.
Tēnā koe, Your Worship, and kia ora, Ms. Philippe, Dr. Philippe, for your work, and especially thanks for the work that's been done to accommodate the needs around accessibility. I think it's a great step forward. I have 2 questions. The first is around the use of green space, and it's hard to tell from high-level illustrations, but is that all green space to be looked at, or is there green space being included in the design that people can be in? I'm talking about small patches of lawn or some such, rather than sitting on a resin bench looking at a tree, which is kind of what the drawings look like.
It's a fair enough question. Look, in order to have a meaningful green space that people can actually occupy, you first need to have that piece of land there to become the green space. So, you know, potentially a parking lot that was no longer needed, or some patch of land that was otherwise not being utilized to its highest capacity could be looked at. But in this instance, we didn't have sort of a centralized piece of land to be playing with for that. I would love to see a pocket park, for example, in the warehouse precinct, but we didn't have that land available to us in these upgrades. What I would say is that what we're trying to do on the eastern sunny side of Bond Street with our design revisions is to provide a series of those planted areas that are that give you a sense of feeling contained within a planted environment. So while you might not be sitting on grass per se, there is a kind of in and out in the legibility of the streetscape and how those plants might be sort of framing your seating area, that you're sitting within them. So as much as possible, while still retaining the functionality of that being a movement street, tried to provide that effect. But I would love to see more pocket parks in the future. So.
Thank you. And just secondly, and picking up from the conversation at the last committee meeting, really around working backwards from planning for the use of private motor vehicles, or more pertinently, the parking of private motor vehicles. There is a wider piece of work going on within transport, I understand, around the needs, parking needs in the central city and central city suburbs. Was it not considered more appropriate for the mitigation, parking mitigation part of this project to be deferred until we had a better understanding, rather than trying to, on a project-by-project basis, claw back little bits and pieces for essentially political reasons? We don't know. There could be a genuine need, we don't know. But it seems to be, it seems like if we are doing some work around a coordinated needs assessment, that would be a more appropriate time to deal with the downstream effects of any of this urban renewal regeneration stuff that we're doing.
It's a good point, and I agree that we're looking at parking more holistically across the city, which I think is a really important thing to have a strategy in place moving forward, which I think I mentioned at the last meeting as well. But in this instance, we do need to look at parking simply because what we're proposing on Bond and Water Street is actually going to be removing some car parks and reorganizing some of those parking spaces, especially with the revisions that we've done in the past few weeks. And what we wanted to ensure was that that wasn't going to have a hugely negative effect on people in the area. So we needed to look further down at the area that we were already looking at in terms of upgrades and see if we could bring back some of that parking to try and balance out the numbers a bit more. So what that means is that in our efforts to build curb build-outs, for example, on the southern end of Bond Street, we gain a little bit of room and we're able to put some angled parking there where there isn't currently angled parking and make up some of those numbers that basically what we're doing is shifting a bit of the parking from northern Bond Street to southern Bond Street. So those people that will have relied on that parking on northern Bond Street can still park just a little bit further down and get a nice high-quality walk in between when they go to work in the morning. So that I take your point and I agree with you, but at the same time there was a necessity in this instance to make sure that we managed it all properly and together.
Councillor Elder. No, it'll go if you just...
Sorry. Just a couple of questions, actually. I love the design and I love the tiles. Can you tell us a bit more about the tiles? Because it's quite integrated into the road as well, just the tiles especially for traffic driving on it.
Okay, so that might be a detail that that wasn't picked up in the report, but in the shared space design, it'd actually be a resin surface. So it's actually not tiles or paving per such at the moment that we're proposing. There will be proper pavers put in the curb build-outs at the edges of that shared space. So if you have a look at the plan where it borders Rattray Street or Princess Street, but then with that larger weaving pattern that you see in the drawings, it's actually a resin surface. So it would be,
okay.
Yeah, and at a later date, if funding did become available, additional funding, then we could look in a few years at upgrading that to a series of pavers, and that can perform very well in that kind of environment, but it requires a certain amount of underground infrastructure that's a bit more expensive, and that's why we can't do it right now. So it would require probably a concrete pad to take the load of the vehicles. So
It certainly looks very attractive in the picture, you know, that integrating the path with the road, etc. The other thing I was just inquiring about is with all infrastructure, we're looking at sculpture, etc., and art and what have you, and it's certainly included in that. But the consultation with Kaitahu and the, around those spaces reflecting the tangata whenua and mana whenua,
yeah, as much
what's
as
the
possible.
process there?
Oh, sorry. We provided a draft plan to the Kaitahu community, and we got their feedback over a series of a couple of months. And in this instance, the feedback was relatively minor and mostly about encouraging future engagement around the Exchange Square and Central City plan upgrades. And what we're doing to proactively work toward that is to commission the continuation of what is currently a draft, but has been sitting as a draft for a number of years, a cultural narrative to help inform our placemaking efforts within the central city so that we can do so from a sort of first step forward.
Councillor Laufiso.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Dr. Philip and your team for all this mahi, and kia kaha for the next few months. My question relates to feedback, so I'm referring to point 8. And I note that Generation Zero was late in making a submission, so they came to the public forum. And I'm just wanting to know, please, what has been the nature of your reconsideration of their feedback? Have you actually had face-to-face meeting or what? Thank you.
No, I haven't, but I didn't have a follow-up meeting with them, but I did have a very thorough reading through of their submission a few times and listened quite carefully to what they had to say at the meeting last time. And what I found, correct me if you think I've misinterpreted it, was recognition of the value of the shared space and wanting to push that space into a bolder design concept. So along the same or similar lines of what kind of feedback I felt like I was receiving from the councillors as well. And so what we did do, largely in response to what they had to say and what you all had to say, was looking at that, maximising that place value on the eastern sunny side of Bond Street, and it actually did result in that loss of some of that parking in that shared space environment, which we're looking to kind of balance out further south. But certainly they did push our thinking and push our enthusiasm for really trying to create a true shared space. So their submission was valuable, and yeah.
Any further questions? Councillor Wiley, do you have a question or more?
Yes, Your Worship. First of all, in background, paragraph 4, you talked about what your work has done today, and you talked about recent community engagements and design. Then in paragraph 18, you talk about going back to the community, and the third bullet point, release the proposed parking plan for stakeholder feedback and attachment. Is there going to be much difference between those two, you think, or you just elaborate?
Councillor Wiley, I might get you to repeat that, and we're having difficulty just adjusting the volume to get the optimum clarity. So if you could repeat that, perhaps just a little slower, thanks.
Okay.
Not your fault, it's the technology.
Okay. Crystal, in paragraph 4 in background, you talk about the engagement and background to what you've done and the community and stakeholder engagement.
Yes?
Then in next steps, paragraph 18 on page 40, you talk about release the proposed parking plan for stakeholder feedback. Can you just elaborate on that?
In regard to the stakeholder feedback for parking, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, we're still having some technical difficulties, but if I understand it correctly, you're asking about the parking and how that will go out to for stakeholder feedback in the coming months?
Correct.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll do something quite similar to what we did with the other stage of the warehouse precinct work, which was only a few months ago that we went out for stakeholder feedback on that parking plan, those parking changes on Vogel Street. And what we did was we submitted flyers to the community, and we'll make sure that we cover all of our bases and make sure that all of the building owners as well as the business owners and residents get a copy of that flyer, whether it's digital or a hard copy, and have an opportunity to feedback. And that feedback's very valuable because it can help us fine-tune. For example, we may not know that a business is really in need of a 5-minute park or very in need of a loading zone, that kind of thing. And when we get that feedback, then it helps us sort of fine-tune those details before we lock it in.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And my next question was, has any discussion taken place with the ORC? And the reason I asked that question is I note the bus route is obviously up and down Princess Street, and knowing how they've recently changed the bus routes, I was trying to work out where bus parking would potentially could happen on Cumberland or the other one-way streets.
Well, we're essentially not making any changes to the one-way streets at this stage because that's a more complicated process and something for a later date.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Newell and then Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Your Worship. And Dr. Fleet, thank you very much for the work so far. Just a quick note to say I'm very excited about it. It looks great what's already happening over in the warehouse precinct with multi different sort of tiles and textures is looking great, and it bodes well for the future. So well done.
Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Your Worship. A question. In the report, it says that the stage 3 and 4 work is budgeted for in this and the next financial year, but also sets out what seems like a fair chunk of the work that is being that is having funding requested for it through the 10-year plan. So it's just a little unclear as to what's budgeted and what's not.
Everything that's, yeah, sorry for any confusion, everything that's drawn here is fully budgeted for. It's what isn't budgeted for is creating the shared space, upgrading the shared space at a later date with paved material and that sort of underground concrete pad that would support that paving from the vehicle weight. So we can achieve it now with the resin surfaces, and that extra funding would allow that space to be upgraded with a higher quality material, or different material, if you will, at a later date. So everything that we've drawn and proposed here is fully funded.
So essentially the add-ons to this will be competing with various other urban design amenity upgrades across the central city through the 10-year plan process. Is that how you imagine this is going to work? Like, how does this fit with the central city plan work?
I guess that's a question for you all. I mean, essentially, it would be competing to some extent, but it also is an important aspect of the Central City Plan work. And I know it sort of has a history of being thought of separately, but I very much see it as a lead up to the rest of the Central City Plan work. So, for example, what could be thought of with the shared space is if this resin surface shared space works and is well received and we manage to activate it well and the community responds well, it very well might be worth the council's investment to put in extra money to upgrade that to pavers that are going to last, rather than 10 years, last 100 years. And with that kind of feedback that we can get from the community, we can also be making our design decisions with you and with consultation and stakeholder feedback in terms of what we do in the central city. So it's kind of it's about combining the efforts, not necessarily dividing them.
Thank you. So what is the total budget for this capital works? 1.25 million is for the next stage.
No, that's for these ones here.
That's for this work?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, and excuse my voice. Just, if people come with feedback that they want bike parks, because there are none provided on road at the moment, would that be anticipated to be on footpath, or that there will be a something provided? Because there's no talking to it in the document to date.
Apologies. I think I might have mentioned bicycle parking briefly in the previous report, but there is bicycle parking provided within this, and we could always put in more at a later date.
Oh, apologies if I've missed that, and I certainly wouldn't want to. But when I look at attachment B, sorry, it's not specifically in there, is it? Or
no, it isn't. But that's traditionally we haven't shown bicycle parking on a vehicle parking plan. I mean, we could include it, I suppose.
Well, and sorry, this is an issue that's come up in 2GP, and we certainly haven't resolved it there either.
Yeah.
But the reason I'm raising it now is where would you anticipate it going if it isn't on road, and how that may compromise exactly what you're trying to do is to urbanise some of these areas where foot traffic, because if it's going to be on the footpath, what that looks like isn't always that pretty either.
True. Well, as far as I'm aware, the reception of the bicycle stands that we have actually put within the warehouse precinct have been relatively well received. So we'd be looking at a continuation of those. And again, along that eastern sunny side of Bond Street, there are these this is kind of amenity space that we've provided for some of that street tree and furniture that may not otherwise be able to exist to that extent on that street. So we have some seating and some planted spaces, but we've also showed some bicycle parking there. And I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding your question.
I'm sorry, I find it very hard to explain. I'm just wondering if there's a need to be more explicit when it comes to parking designs, which you've got in attachment B, which is what we're asking for feedback to what that might look like, or even a statement that cycling is seen as on footpath as opposed to on road, because otherwise in that part, which is a feedback document, it doesn't look particularly transparent that it's there.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, that's yeah.
Just to clarify, I'm trying to figure out what's being asked. Would it make a big difference?
Please.
Thank you. I think the suggestion is that you can't separate out entirely the different parking spaces allocated to different modes of transport, and that you might get different feedback on a parking plan that's being put out for stakeholder engagement if the different modal parking options are made explicit in that form, because it may or may not mitigate concerns or otherwise. I think that's the question that's being asked, and would that be difficult to do at this point?
Look, I think it wouldn't be difficult. I think it makes sense, especially if we're looking at a shared space environment where we do have different modes of transport coexisting, and we're encouraging that. So it's literally just something that hadn't crossed my mind in terms of this plan, and putting that on the parking plan per se. But it makes a lot of sense now that you raise it, and we can certainly look at integrating it.
Any further questions? Any further? Oh, Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Crystal, on page 48, I'm just looking at the Rattray Princess Street exchange area. You've looked at the street behind it, which I believe is Water Street and Water Street and Bond Street. Is any work projected to be in the exchange area? Because I understood Glenn Hazelton worked on something previous, and will this tie back into this work that we have in front of us?
Oh, in the exchange. Yeah, sorry, still struggling with the comms. Yeah. Yes, the idea is that whatever we do here works with what we do in the exchange area, but no particular plans have ever been locked in for that. There was significant stakeholder engagement done in regard to the exchange square, but there was no permanent plans put forward and approved. So that's something that we'll be looking at as part of Central City Plan work.
But it would, I guess the plan is to tie it all together when it gets done.
Yes, very much the idea is that it all works together.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Right, any further questions? Would someone like to, you're going to move, Councillor Benson-Pope, is there a seconder for the Councillor Gary? Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Benson-Pope?
Thank you, Your Worship. In looking at the paper, I'm also mindful of the very strong support there is around the table, unanimous in fact, or with no dissent anyway, for these sort of initiatives. And I think we're in a really good place for our community to look at what the options are. I mean, clearly we know that there's a large amount of work as yet undesigned in the main street, but we do have the trial out front that people have already alluded to. There's been some great work, I'll come back to that. There's been some great work already happened in the warehouse precinct, and I guess a lot of you and a lot of the community, as I am, are watching with great interest the work in Jetty Street. And it's a shame that Councillor Hall isn't here, but I was delighted when I read in the community paper of his discovery of the paving stones, the blue stone from his cattle yard or someone's cattle yard. I hope they know about it. And I think it's been really well integrated into the designs that down there. It's going to be really interesting. And I'm sure when the livestock gets added, people will be fascinated by it. And I think the capacity of developments like this to enrich our city and make it more vibrant and interesting and welcoming to people, our people and visitors alike, is really illustrated by this sort of work. And so the work that's slightly different with the resins in this era, I think, is a really positive idea. People will be able to judge what they think about it, whether it works or whether it doesn't, whether they like it or whether they don't. And similarly, I've already noticed just in a few days of talking to people out front here, people have views about what sort of paving they like, whether they like the elegant and most expensive large flagstones or whether they like the other ones and so on. And a bit of time will enable us to see what lays and stays satisfactorily laid, and also to see what soils, shall I say, euphemistically, more readily than others. Given that we don't have a cleaning regime for our footpaths, there's not an issue with cleaning the paving, of course, but that's a debate for another day. So I think it's important that people do look at these pavers, look at these treatments, look at the design, decide how much grey they want in the world, and I'm sure that the community will be more than forthcoming about that as we move forward to do a great deal more of this work throughout the city.
I didn't want to interrupt, but I'm sorry, and I did see staff members shaking his head, and I feel very sorry I assure you that there is a cleaning regime, albeit not adequate to the certain councillors' point of view, but I would hate that statement to go unchallenged.
It's a sweeping regime, not a cleaning regime.
Just to clarify the statement process, I take it that your point of order was point taken. Are there any further speakers?
You might not.
Well, touch it. Anyway, it's not on now.
Went on for about 1 second.
Well,
She muted it for you.
is it on now?
What about now? Can you hear me now?
Testing, oh, right. Let's hope it stays on, right. So there are no further, Councillor O'Malley and then Councillor Gary.
I just want to actually give you a quick compliment on public engagement. I'm really pleased to see that you have gone, and especially the Disabilities Issues Advisory Group and the Disabled People's Assembly. And it's really good to see also you're going to be going through one more iteration before anything gets too fixed in place, because I think that actually brings the public along, and in the end saves us a lot of money in the end because we're not digging up something afterwards. So thank you very much.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. I want to speak in support of this motion and compliment the staff on their work thus far. This tips its hat to bold and creative, and that really excites me. I think with the trial aspect and trying different things out, the start with the resin gives an opportunity for the community to engage in these future designs as we work through the city to freshen it up. And we talk about a livable city and we talk about a memorable city, and these things contribute to that. So I'm very excited about it, and I look forward to the progress. Let's get started, let's get on with it.
Thank you all.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you. And to reiterate my earlier points, just to talk with Councillor O'Malley's feedback around inclusive urban design. It's an incredibly important issue and only going to be of use to a growing percentage of our city's population as time goes on. So thank you for doing that. I've certainly not been shy in my frustrations around the delays to the wider central city plan work in terms of what we're doing with our main shopping district, which is why I think projects like this in the interim are crucial really to maintain momentum and interest in the community for the upgrade of our city's urban design. We've had phenomenal work that's been noted obviously in the warehouse precinct, largely led by private investment, but also other little pockets around. If you look at the work of Mr Van Aert and Mr Daniels on the corner of Princess Street and Rattray Street, and things like this start to link together these little bits and pieces that have been to some extent encouraged by the city, but to a large degree driven by private development for the greater good of the city's streetscape, and eventually it will crawl its way along to George Street and Lower Moray Place and Stewart Street and Bath Street, I'm sure. But until then, work like this, and Jetty Street too in terms of connections, work like these small isolated projects where people can see the value of investing in a higher quality of accessible and well-designed streetscape and public amenity can only be useful in terms of bringing people into the conversation around what our central city ends up looking like in the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years, however long that process takes to take hold. So I commend you for your efforts and for taking on board the feedback that's been received both formally and through public fora as this paper has worked its way through the process, and good luck.
Further speakers? Do you wish to exercise your right of reply? Okay, the resolutions have been moved as on the order papers, so I'll put it. All those in favour, please say... Oh, Councillor Wiley, did you wish to speak?
No, I'm okay. I'm about to say aye.
Right. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. Thanks, Anna. Okay, can I invite Mr Cooper and Mr Thompson up? We're at item 10, the annual report of Dunedin City Holdings Limited. Keith? Steve? Line light there. We'll just stick to Dunedin City Holdings report in the first instance. That's the one in front of us. So, do you want to introduce anything or preface any with any remarks?
I'll just open the floor to questions.
Questions? Okay. Questions, councillors. Now we're on item 10, the Dunedin City Holdings Limited annual report. Any questions? Yep, Councillor Wiley.
For Mr Thompson, you sent an email or a press release came out this afternoon or this morning about the result. Obviously, there was DCHL was quite happy about how it all finished up. Can you just expand upon that?
First up, I'm standing in for Graham Crombie, who's an apology today. Steve Thompson's here with me to answer any Delta Aurora specific points, and I'm here to answer all other. I wouldn't say we were happy by any stretch of the imagination. It was a result of many other factors. There's been some good highlights within the group, but clearly there's been some big cost imposts which is going to affect the performance of DCHL in the short to medium term. So no, not happy, but it is a fair reflection of what's been going on in the past year.
The profit was better than expected though?
In view of what occurred during the year, yes.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Worship. It's a procedural question, really, and I note that this report, the DCHL annual report, is put to us for noting rather than for approval, which is something that I would understand for the subsidiary companies because we don't have direct ownership of them. But is that not an option in this case? So were there to be challenges or amendments or what that the council would want to make in the DCHL annual report, what would be the formal mechanism to do that?
The annual reports are, of course, a statement of performance for the year. So perhaps if you raise your concerns or things that you think are not right, if they're not right, then they need to be put right. But obviously at this point in the year, it's not possible to change the performance for last year. If there are things that relate to next year, then the letter of expectation, that process is there in order to try and make a change happen into the future. So,
Well, I think the other response I'd have to that, Councillor, is that the report is from the DCHL board, and as the Chief Executive says, we can question it, but we can't change it because the report isn't from this council. It's not our report. But that doesn't mean you're not entitled to disagree with something or question it or whatever, but we can't do other than note it. We don't ever approve reports from other people as such. I wouldn't have thought.
To be clear, I'm not questioning any of the financial results that are in here. My questions are really around framing and the context that is provided in the report. So in the forward from the chair of DCHL, it doesn't particularly mention any of the challenges that are being faced by the group, which seems like something that you would want to include up front if you were to be reporting, rather than expecting people to wade through the subsidiary company annual reports. Some mention of headwinds, I would expect, would be something that you could include there by way of context, but it's not particularly so in this case.
Okay. It occurs to me that were council of a mind, and I'm not saying they are, and I'm not saying you are, were council of a mind to be unhappy with any aspect of it, they could choose not to accept the report. So I will ask Ms Graham about the context of... it's a question. It's not a suggestion, it's a question. But I'm just...
I'm not planning on going.
That's fine. Okay. Well,
Perhaps
but perhaps we might like to gather those comments in a letter too.
yeah, just to hopefully a bit of clarity, we did take on board the feedback last year, and we passed that feedback on to the operating entity, because that's essentially where a lot of the activity occurs. There's examples around what City Forest does in terms of their social interaction with the community, making their forests available, the birds, those sorts of things. So we very much take that on board. We do give that to the operating entities because that's where it has to happen. I would say, however, we also do make what we would say is a good attempt to hopefully answer those points you've made, but happy to take that on board, and there's always room for improvement.
Yeah, and that's really heartening, and it is mentioned further down in the report. I just think, and it's not always necessarily challenges. I mean, City Forest is a perfect example of really great work that's happening. It would just be useful to see some mention of that in the executive summary, if you like, which is likely to be the most read section of this report by people who may not do the wading through. But so thank you for including it. It's just would be good to foreground it a little more. Thanks.
Councillor Gary.
Mr Cooper, this is a very specific clarification I was after, but on page 7, under Directors' Reports in the DCHL report, it talks about Taieri Gorge Railway Limited operating with a constrained tourism market. This came as a bit of a surprise to me at a time when our tourism sector's actually been increasing. I wondered if you could expand on that comment, please, to clarify it for me.
All fairness, I'd probably sympathise with you. That said, from an operational level, they have had challenges through the year. There has been some challenges around tourist numbers. On one hand, we see they're up, but just getting them on the trains has been sometimes a challenge for them. But I think they've probably been in the space for the last couple of seasons where they've done particularly well. So that's perhaps poor wording, to be fair.
Thank you for that. I'm still very puzzled, but thank you.
Councillor Elder.
Hi, I was particularly interested
one of your responsibilities is health and safety, and there's health and safety all through this. But I was just wondering what, another aspect of health and safety is not just physical safety. What's in place around people feeling safe in their workplace in the sense of stress, pressure, mental health, work-life balance, etc. So more around the culture of a company, and also their ability to be well and have good relationships in there. So more around well-being. What kind of things are in place to make sure that that's happening?
To my mind, that's not a legislative requirement or a regulatory requirement. It's more of best practice or good hygiene within an organisation. We have had, bearing in mind DCHL is not the operating entity, so we're reliant on reports from the operating entities. We've had some good examples where people or the businesses have taken that on board and have done some programs, responded to requirements from their staff. So whilst I can't say there's a written policy, there's certainly from a health perspective in terms of anti-bullying, there's policies in place through most of the businesses to encourage people to come forth, and it is encouraged, and there are some health and wellbeing initiatives and programs. I wouldn't say they're necessarily documented, but they are very much on the radar of the companies.
So are they looking to make that more formal in the health and safety procedures of their different companies?
Health and safety in itself is very, very broad, and I don't think anybody would be hiding behind the regulations to say we don't have to take account of that. It's just good practice, and I'm very confident the businesses are very cognizant of that and will be responding to any staff requirements.
Further questions? You're going to move? Moved, Councillor Wilson. Is there a second? Councillor Newell. This is the recommended note in the annual report. Any discussion?
Yes, just can we have some resolution about that question that was asked that Ms Graham said she'd have to take some advice on? I mean, it seems to me there are no options for us in respect of our satisfaction or otherwise with these reports, in that they are historical, and much in all there's material in at least one of them which people find unpalatable to put.
Well, this is, let's stick to the City Holdings one.
I know it is, but the Dunedin City Holdings is also responsible for oversight of the group. And so I wonder if we could have an answer to the question of whether we have any capacity to do anything other than note, even with displeasure.
Ms Graham.
No. The reports are for noting. There's some requirements that they have to have in them in terms of the Local Government Act. The reports have all of those, and they just need to be presented within 3 months of the end of the financial year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. If there's no discussion, I can put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? No. Carried. Okay. Do you want that noted, Councillor Lafisa? Yep. You got that, Lynn? Right, item 11, annual reports of the subsidiaries. Would you wish to preface these with any comments?
Yes. As I said, Steve Thompson, being the now chair of Aurora, but it was also the chair of Delta through the transition period, has joined us. So we'll deal with I suggest we deal with the Aurora Delta up front to allow Steve to depart and do something else with his time. So just to put a bit of context around the Aurora Delta, because it started the year off as one. In terms of operations, it always was two separate legal entities, but it was operated as arguably a single entity. So back early last year, the DCHL board started, following the report from Murray and Co, which raised some points around the fact that it was one entity, or two entities doing one function, if you like. That stimulated DCHL to start thinking about, were there other options? We had formed an opinion that there was probably a lack of tension and a lack of competition within the model that had a single management structure, albeit with two different companies. We started to get close to that. Our first move was to stop a rebranding exercise, which the company was mooting, because we weren't comfortable we were going to have a single brand at the end of the day, although we hadn't got too far through that process. The first port of call was looking at changing the board for a variety of reasons. Probably some of them have become more transparent now. So that was done as the first step, and that was the appointment of Steve Thompson to the board of both Aurora and Delta. As we were starting to pursue the idea of re-engaging Murray & Co. To start building a business case, to look at the separation, look at the cost of the separation, and I will come back to those costs shortly, that was superseded by both Steve saying, just give us a bit of time. Internally, we may be able to take the action without going through the external business case build. And then, of course, the poll issue arose, which resulted in the Deloitte report, which resulted in a series of actions being taken, leading to where we are now with two separate companies at an operational level, a new board and CEO in the Delta organisation, a new board in Aurora, with the pending appointment of a new CEO. So that was a bit of a Reader's Digest version of what has happened over probably the last 12 to 18 months, ending up where we are today. So in terms of costs, which was something that we would have been, I suppose in hindsight, had we engaged Murray & Co. or any other entity to do a full-blown analysis, which we would have been reporting to council on, to get your approval, which would have included a whole range of costs. That was sort of overshadowed by the Deloitte report and a somewhat automated let's do it process without what would normally be a fairly robust approval process with council. So that's how we got to where we are. So the costs are significant, separate, even though they were two separate legal entities. Separating the companies has been expensive and will continue to be so as the companies ultimately head down, moving away from shared services into being totally independent. There's obviously a lot of benefits of that as well, and they will be proven in time in terms of competitive tension between the two organisations as Aurora embarks on a fairly robust and expensive program over the next 10 years. Obviously, part of that is restructuring. HR issues are always prevalent in any sort of model which we undertook, which was significant. And that results in various costs being incurred as a means to get to an end. Quite simply, we had people, and there's a number of people, their positions changed, their responsibilities changed, and therefore that does mean their terms of employment have been changed, and often that takes a buyout provision to execute those changes. So they're the necessary evils. The employment law is always paramount. And always sides on the employee. So we made some, what we would say, the right decisions to get the outcomes in the best interest of the business. So I think I've summarised where we've got to. From a DCHL perspective, we're very pleased with how the two boards are operating. We still have one appointment to make to Delta. Aurora has a full pack, other than they're still in the process of appointing a CEO, which is probably quite imminent.
Steve, do you want to say? I think this one. Okay, questions, councillors? Councillor Gary.
Mr. Thompson, I wonder if you could answer this question. To those people in the community who will understand that there is employment law and will understand that there's a certain market level that's required, but found your comments around a band of employees, and I don't want to be specific about who, I'm just talking in general terms here, who work very hard and have a high level of expertise. members of the community who found those comments exceedingly offensive, because there are many people in the community who work very hard and have a high level of expertise, but perhaps they're not paid at very high levels. I just wonder what you would say to them.
Well, I think it's a matter of comparing apples with apples, and we're not employing members of the community who work hard and obviously do work hard and get paid less. We're dealing with a marketplace where we have a resource to fill, and we need to fill it by employing people out of that marketplace. The market determines the price for those people based on their skills and their knowledge in, in the industry. So it's not a comment against anyone in particular, it's just a statement of fact.
Councillor Lord.
Excuse me, Mr Thompson, it's probably a leading question, but for example, when you're looking now for a new chair for Aurora, and you say it's almost imminent, like, would you have people that would turn down jobs like that because the market locally is not high enough compared with other similar jobs around the country?
I hope you mean chief executive and not chair.
Yeah, sorry, chief executives, yeah. Chair, we shouldn't be paying at all. No, I'm just joking.
Yes, in fact, that has been the situation, that we've got into the process and the remuneration levels offered for the job, which have been independently determined, by the way, have not met the expectations of potential applicants, so they've chosen not to continue in the process.
Councillor Laufisa.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr Thompson, I'm just following up on Councillor Gary's question about the market. So in the course of your company's work or your board's work, do you actually do any research as to find out whether the market might in fact actually be wrong?
Well, the world I live in, the market is the market. So I'll explain our processes around the remuneration. Dunedin City Holdings has just recently clearly set out its expectations around how we would go about setting remuneration inside each of the council-controlled organisations. And we're very comfortable with the approach that's been taken. So we're following that process and the policy that's been established. So I'm completely comfortable with how we're proposing to recruit in the market and how we have to deal with the realities of the South Island, Dunedin, and then the huge amount of resource that we need to bring into this region to carry out the huge amount of work that we've got ahead of us. I mean, there's $721 million worth of work predicted to be needed to be done in the next 10 years. That is a massive amount of work, and we need a huge amount of resource to achieve it. So we're already operating in an extremely constrained resource market. You may be aware that Powerco are currently planning to spend, I think it's about $1.4 billion on their network. That's putting tremendous pressure on the sector. These people who operate in the sector, and I accept every sector has people who are expert. In this particular sector, the expert people that we need to achieve the outcomes to improve the profile of our network are in very serious demand overseas and in New Zealand. And it's an unfortunate consequence that to achieve the work, we're going to have to pay the market price to get the people to achieve the outcomes that we need to, which is about having a safe and reliable network at the end of the day. That's what we're focused on.
Councillor O'Malley.
First, thank you, Mr Thompson, for coming here today. I mean, it's good to see you here. I'm going to ask two questions, and then there's going to be follow-on questions from those. And the first one is, how integrated are the Central Otago networks from the metropolitan Dunedin area networks? Or could they be separated or considered separately in any way?
I've actually excuse me, I had to leave the board meeting today to get here, and one of the things that we approved today was the integration of the SCADA systems between Central Otago and Dunedin, and that's been a real challenge to actually achieve that. So that's actually a milestone achievement for us, to get effectively the approval and the IT capability to actually have electronic integration effectively, be able to monitor the networks together. So that's a big step forward. Up until today, it hasn't been possible, so they've operated effectively as independent networks, yeah.
Okay, so I guess then, could we then actually look at them, obviously before this integration occurs, then the metropolitan Dunedin area network could be considered, could be at least, doesn't have to be considered separate from the Central Otago when looking at them as entities and providers of transmission?
Oh, absolutely. You know, the Central Otago was brought on after the Dunedin network existed, so yeah. You would uncouple a lot of the integration that's occurred. I mean, obviously the back office functions are integrated. We're talking now about SCADA, which is really the front office integration. So it's pretty much an integrated network now, but you can decouple it because it started out as uncoupled.
Cool. And then I've got a question going back, sort of historical question, and obviously I'm not looking, there's definitely no blame with this question, but the Deloitte's report indicated that a lot of the problems Aurora got into was because it was paying dividends to the council, and in doing so deferred maintenance on its system. So now we're looking at the system that requires significant maintenance upgrade. If we were to ask DCL, or instruct DCL to ask Aurora to provide no dividend and return all income into the infrastructure or price reduction, could we do that theoretically? So in other words, currently we're asking the council-controlled organisation to provide us with a dividend, and that money is being deferred away by virtue of the fact that we take it away from infrastructure maintenance.
So you're talking about Aurora paying a dividend or DCHL paying a dividend?
Or Aurora paying a dividend to...
Okay, well, I think it's already been determined that Aurora won't be paying a dividend for the next 3 years.
Right, it is. So if we have Aurora operating as a council-controlled organisation that is now putting all of its money back into maintenance of the infrastructure, and effectively, ultimately when that's over, potentially we could ask it then to keep that on top of price of transmission. How would that differ if Aurora was in fact a department of the City Council at that point? In terms of it's taking income in for transmission, it's putting that income back to maintenance of the infrastructure, and therefore the cycle is between income and the infrastructure alone, and not providing a dividend or payment back to the city. How is that different from what a department would be doing if it was, let's say, our water department?
I wouldn't see it as any different.
Well, that's actually, the reason I'm framing those questions is because I think as we go forward, these are some of the considerations for us to think of and that's why I said separate from Central Otago, because Central Otago is not our metropolitan area, but Dunedin City is our metropolitan area. And so as we look at this, I'm wondering to the CEO, or probably through the chair if we can run this point, if we were to look at a council-controlled organisation, especially an infrastructure providing one, and then through our analysis say it doesn't really look much different from a department because we're not getting a dividend, should we then consider actually what its structure is and how we relate to it? And actually either of you can answer that question if you feel.
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure that you've got that option under the Electricity Act.
And that's actually, well, that was the point that I made when I was asked this week about whether or not we can or can't, and whether or not, in fact, it's acts that sit above us that actually influence our ability to act. Probably still worth going through the mental exercise, though, and that way at least we can then maybe when we meet with our central MPs.
There is one thought that occurs to me, though, that might be slightly provocative, but I don't think you get the range and skill level of people willing to work for a department of local government compared with a standalone lines company?
Works for our water department. Because I mean, in other councils, that is a CCO, and it's a department inside us. So I think that would be a philosophical discussion that we might follow up with later.
It would also be based on my experience in employing people and the comments that they make, because in the process that we are going through at the moment, the degree of separation that exists between the council and the council companies is an important consideration for many people interested in jobs.
Engineers and linesmen.
And professional managers, yeah.
If they were a department, would we need the same level and the same number of professional managers as we do with the council-controlled organisation?
And I can answer that.
Yeah. Well, I basically wanted to raise this concept, and I'm pretty much done with the question. Thank you.
It also starts to suggest that you would have a potential $1 billion investment with no return.
Except reliable electricity and a reasonable price of transmission. We have a multi-billion-dollar investment in our water department and in our roads, and we don't expect economic return on bridges. So to include electricity under that headline, and then and I'm not hoping water's going to get included, to exclude water and roads seems a relatively arbitrary position in which to make that point.
Could I just make a point here, which I think is a standard misconception in this community around the performance of the company on price and reliability? It's absolutely an empirical fact that this is one of the most reliable networks in New Zealand. Remember that. It is one of the most reliable networks in New Zealand up until we started doing the remediation. So that is a fact. The PwC compendium will assist you in understanding that. So that's actually an amazing achievement, given that it's the second oldest network in New Zealand. But obviously it couldn't carry on like that. But that is the first fact. Second fact is that the pricing from this network is in the lower quartile in New Zealand as well. So your comments I reject about pricing and reliability. This is extremely reliable network on a New Zealand standard basis, and it is one of the best priced networks on a New Zealand standard basis.
Thank you. I didn't actually make any comments related to the rest of New Zealand in terms of our price or reliability. The comment I made was, did we defer maintenance during the years, in previous years, because we paid dividends, which I think we all agreed on we did. So I have not made any comments on whether it is an unreliable system or whether it's an expensive system. The question I ask, and I'm just sticking exclusively and only to that question, is if this was a department inside the council, would it have operated any differently? And I think the point is I don't really want to go any further forward.
Councillor, if that's the questions you've asked have been answered, but that question is not one that Mr. Thompson can answer.
And that's why I'm saying I'm withdrawing. I don't see any point in continuing the debate, and I'm sitting down.
Nor do I. Thank you. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I think we've all learned today that about $8 million is a standard rate for an effective chief executive. If you guys wanted to extend, particularly if you want to fight regulatory reform. Your service is noted, Dr. Bidrose, thank you. The elephant in the room obviously is page 15 of the Delta report, which has attracted some degree of public interest. It's a few orders of degree lower than our friends at Fonterra, but we do note that an extra column needed to be found to account for the remuneration bands within that company. I have a number of questions that I want to ask of that, but I also accept that there are legitimate reasons for them not to be answered publicly, given the privacy of the individuals involved, but I seek guidance from the Chair as to whether you're comfortable with them being at least asked publicly, because I feel like there's a degree of interest in our community to know that we are at least asking these questions of the holdings company and the Delta board.
Well, I'm comfortable with you asking them, because I'm quite confident that Mr. Cooper and Mr. Thompson given their responsibilities to their employees, will make it clear when they cannot divulge the answers. But I would suggest that they may also want to specify when they couldn't divulge the answers in non-public either. Because there will be, I assume, and I stand to be corrected, but I assume that there are some details of contracts which you wouldn't be able to divulge even in a non-public meeting. But I'll let you speak to that if you will.
Yes, I agree.
But if I'm happy for you to ask questions. Can I suggest that if you may get more productive answers if you ask them somewhat generically? I mean, in terms of what you want from the questioning. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your indulgence. Of the $980,000 to $990,000 that one Delta employee was paid in the last financial year, what portion of that was salary relative to other liabilities?
Well, I can't answer that question because it's subject to a confidential agreement between the employer and the employee.
In either a public or non-public forum?
Yeah, it's confidential, full stop.
In coming to that figure, was there any attempt made or thought given by the board of Delta to negotiate that, given the circumstances surrounding the departure and the restructure?
The outcomes are negotiated contractual obligations.
What salary band is it anticipated that the chief executives of Aurora and Delta will sit within in the 17-18 year?
That is a question that I could theoretically answer, but we are currently going through the recruitment process and are at a very, pivotal stage. And so I think it would compromise our negotiating position and in some way may compromise some of the outcomes that you're seeking if I was to go into that in detail today. But you can be absolutely certain that we have taken on board the instruction and policies established by DCHL around remuneration.
Are we able to get a sense of what the median income is for a Delta employee and what the lowest paid full-time worker within a relevant and appropriate salary band is within that company?
Look, I'm certain that information could be made available, for sure, yeah. It will be just a matter of asking the chair of Delta.
Is that something that could be included in future annual reporting as a measurement? I mean, there's a lot of information about the over $100,000 bracket, but hard to put that into context within the wider workforce and what a median or lower quartile salary might be.
I suppose through the SOI process you could request such information.
And finally, for Mr. Cooper, I guess, and again, it may not be something that you can answer offhand, and apologies for not sending these through, I just found these in my drafts folder. Which, if any, of Council's companies employ or contract out services to workers currently earning less than $20.20 an hour?
You're absolutely correct. I can't answer it. But certainly we will attempt to get that information. And again, I think it's probably useful if that's information is something you believe is relevant and useful for the future, that the whether it's through the letter of expectations or the SIO process, that's included. But certainly we can identify which of the companies are operating below that level.
So, Elder.
I know you're doing a heck of a lot of work, and it's going to take a long time, and that recruitment is an issue because, in fact, other places are looking for the same people. But I want to turn it round and say it is also an opportunity, and one of the things I was thinking about is employment for young people in Dunedin. And is there a way in which we can engage with the schools, with the tertiary institutions regarding apprenticeships and training in a lot of this work, so we can actually create an opportunity for our young people?
Was that for Holdings or for Aurora?
Oh.
Or Delta or...
Could be for any of them,
Yeah,
I suppose,
probably.
but I know that there's $700 million of work to be done, and there's a lot of lack of resource in the sense of staff, and we could turn that around and say this is a great opportunity for the young people of Dunedin to get into this industry.
Yes, you can be absolutely certain that there's going to be a very strong apprenticeship program at Delta to take on board and refresh the workforce and enhance the workforce. So, I mean, that's part of the economic upside of this spend. I mean, this is a massive spend, and the economic upside is actually getting young people trained in the energy industry. It's also about bringing other families to the city to do the work. So, you know, you spend this money, the economic multiplier is going to be significant. It's a nice consequence to have.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. That is the upside, and I think particularly for our young people in Dunedin.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, Mr Thompson, I just had a sort of, it's not a rhetorical question, but in reply to Councillor Hawkins, you said that the payments that had been made in the big bracket were contractual arrangements. So to break contracts, or if you had wanted to do anything outside of that, can I assume that that would result in perhaps potentially much greater costs to the ratepayer if we were trying to do something different to what you've done? Does that make sense? I could rephrase it, but I'm trying to be careful.
I understand the concept, and I think there will be a real danger that if you start breaking contracts, you're going to get yourself into serious trouble. Obviously, you're going to have reputational damage for breaking contracts, which is not going to suit well for future employment of individuals. It's not something that I would want to be party to, breaking contractual obligations. So, and you're right, I think it could have been worse or better, who knows, but the reality is that as far as I'm concerned, if you've got a contractual obligation, you need to meet it.
And as a I'm not supposed to comment here, but as a councillor, I would say that I would also expect boards to follow contractual obligations too. So that's, yeah, thank you.
Are there any further questions? There being none, would some... Oh, sorry, Councillor Wiley, far away.
Yeah, on page, sorry, Mr Cooper, on page 254 of 427, the remuneration page of 378,000, that was paid to more than one person?
So the question was around the 378 termination benefits?
Correct.
No, well, it would be covering more than one of the, yeah.
people in the background, I think. Okay, did you hear that answer, Councillor Wiley?
No, sorry, I didn't.
The payment was for more than one person.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions?
No, I think one's already been asked. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Wiley. Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you. In respect of the 980,000 ban for the past financial year, can you tell us whether there was any performance component in that payment?
No, I can't.
And in terms of that former employee's current employment on a contract, which is a fixed term contract, I understand, before he departs the company, can you tell us if we can expect any similar unpleasant surprises in respect of termination payments? Or at the end of that period, will the next annual report somewhere in a reduced salary band, because it's a partial year, show us that only salary has been paid?
Well, I can't divulge the nature and the terms and conditions of the contract. What I can say is the contract was framed in the context of the policy that was provided by Dunedin City Holdings.
Will you be able to answer that question in private
Well, no, because it goes to the contractual terms of an arrangement between the company and the individual with a confidentiality provision in it.
Further questions? There being none, I'll move from the chair that we note the annual reports from the subsidiaries and associate companies. Do I have a second? Second to Councillor Lord. Any discussion? Councillor O'Malley.
We're accepting the report, and that's all well and good. I think that when we're talking about utilities versus, say, something like city forests, which are investments, we want to consider these entities separately, and I think we need, as we're going forward, understand what acts of Parliament are putting us in the position we're in, and also, as you can tell by the answer of these questions, the extent to which we actually control these companies versus actually owning them. There's a difference between a council-owned organisation and a council-controlled organisation, and if we can't change the structure, at least can we change the name? Thank you.
Further discussion? There being none, I'm going to... Councillor Benson-Pope, sorry. Didn't see your hand.
Well, I think it's clear that we all find this an unfortunate situation, as does the vast majority of I can't imagine there's anyone at the table down here anyway who is even remotely happy with the situation in which we find ourselves demonstrated in this particular report, and I'm not the only person that's previously uttered about what I consider the totally unacceptable level of payment in some of these, I'm speaking generically of course, some of these executive positions in our companies and elsewhere, which has been a highlight of media today. And I think that's something that our wider community also finds distasteful. The problem I have, though, is that we've just had demonstrated to us, as we understand, that there's nothing much we can do about it because it's done and dusted. And of course, replacement staff appointed or currently under recruitment will have their contracts signed off by directors, and they will contain, no doubt, yet another confidentiality clause. And so next year at this time, we are likely to see unpleasant information, potentially, sitting in these annual reports about salary levels that are not acceptable in the wider community. And I think what that says to me is that there is a problem with this management model, and I think we do need to address it. I think what's happening in this community frankly disgusts people. It may well be, and it certainly is, a direct result of the privatisation of the electricity industry. Well, that was a good outcome for New Zealanders, wasn't it? An industry that used to be owned by the citizens of the country, and now it has become an industry where people are receiving what most people would consider as totally inappropriate levels of remuneration. So I think in our context in the city, we need to start re-examining the appropriateness of this model, and I guess the revelations in this report and the poor performance that sits behind this and the process around the structural change of the companies demonstrates that we should do that with a degree of urgency.
Mr Lord.
Well, I just, I don't want to dwell on that one, what seems like a sour note, and I do agree with that, but I also just would like to point out that if people have read their notes, that they will see that both Delta and Aurora have had increases in shareholder equity and in their total assets for the year, and not an insignificant figure, so I just think that's to be commended as well, so thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Notwithstanding my colleague's comment, I just want to concur with Councillor Benson-Pope's comments. I think it's really important as elected representatives we are here to represent our community, to make decisions wisely, and of course to influence policy as the community sees it. So the issue is really with the policy, and it's something that we need to have a very robust discussion around. I do understand that both of you gentlemen are working within frameworks, you're working within the employment law, but I want to make really certain that you hear the feedback that we're hearing from the community. And you explained many of the situations very clearly, and I would hate to think that that suggested any naivety in the community. It's very important that the facts of the matters be communicated carefully. However, the community is not happy, and so while I will be agreeing to note the policy, I do want to make my feelings and the feelings of the community I represent very clear.
Yeah, I just wonder if there would be an opportunity to go into a private session or non-public session to talk.
I'm happy with that. This is the last item on the public agenda, and we're going into non-public. Oh, there's another one, yeah, but there's a short one, but I think that would be useful. Thank you. Okay, are there other speakers? Okay, well, for my part, Councillor Laufiso.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I just want to speak to tautoko the councillors who have spoken about policy. I acknowledge, Mr Cooper and Mr Thompson, that you're just doing the work that you have to do within the frameworks that you have, but I'm strongly advocating a change of policy and acknowledge Councillor O'Malley's point about the names. I think we should have not just the economic bottom line, but we should also have the social and environmental bottom lines as part of our company, whatever the ways that they'll run, and it does require a change of model. And I just came from a couple of weeks ago being at the Polyfest and understanding that there are people, families who can't even afford a $2 coin entry fee for the entry fee, and I just, you know, when I think of that, and then I think of $1 million payout to an executive who hasn't performed, I'm just gobsmacked, and I don't think there's a lot of people in the community that agree with me.
Excuse me, Mr Mayor. Whilst you've suggested we will go into private session, I think it would be remiss of me not to respond for the record. We're charged with governing, overseeing commercial entities. I would hate to be here in the future, not that I would be, to justify the performance of a whole lot of entities because we weren't competitive with the employment market for people to run those businesses. Steve's already amplified the point. We are dealing in a market. We've got to have quality people. If we don't have quality people, you're going to have substandard outcomes. So that's just a cold, hard reality. So we'd be awfully remiss, and I don't think we would be on the boards if we were constrained from employing the right people to operate in the right way.
Are there other speakers? Okay, I just want to clarify that both gentlemen have referred to the expectation that's been conveyed to the subsidiary boards on constrained contractual arrangements. I will clarify that following the revelation of this payment, that I contacted DCHL and explained the council's expectation that that was the case. So that's exactly what they have done, and have confirmed that that's been the situation for some time. Personally, at a principal level, I am also uncomfortable with the vast disparity between very high salaries and the lowest ones in our communities. But I would point out that I think that that is a community issue. It is a matter of society, a societal issue. I'm not specifically talking about our own companies. I'm talking about in general. I think that the disparity between the lowest incomes and some of the higher ones is unfortunate and leads to very poor social outcomes. However, I might be, if we endeavoured to correct that by simply paying people less and accepting the kinds of people who would accept less, I might be even more uncomfortable with the outcomes we got from our companies. And I think that was what Mr. Cooper was alluding to. So I accept that, certainly, the way the model is at the moment, that relatively high salaries are paid for expertise, especially when that expertise is scarce. However, it does appear that relatively high salaries are paid and then contractually have to be adhered to, whether the performance is great or not. And I'd have to say I'm a little uncomfortable with that. So I would suggest that contractual arrangements could be tightened to forestall that outcome. As far as the change in model is concerned, I concur with Mr. Cooper that I would be uncomfortable if the change of model led to an inevitable rundown in service or asset value or value to our community. So I think we have to be very careful about unintended consequences. It's a bit like a number of other situations where there is no ideal situation, there's no ideal choice. They all have downsides, they all produce anomalies, and I'm not being definitive about it, but I suspect that some of the alternatives would have just as many unfortunate outcomes as this one does. With that, I moved that, so that's me speaking and my right of reply. So I'm going to put this. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Now, Councillor Wilson, you had something else you wanted to raise.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I'm hoping that you'll give, the Council will give me the forbearance to raise this under the title of annual reports, albeit Tari Gorge isn't included in here, but I think it would be remiss not to note the retirement of Murray Bond from Tari Gorge after 24 and a half years. And I have to say, and I want to move a vote of thanks to him for his contribution to the city. He has been an exceedingly positive force for the city. He's grown a business which was has been pivotal to the growth of tourism product in Dunedin, but stretched right out to the edges of the city and beyond. At the moment, I think there's a passenger service going right around the South Island thanks to Tari Gorge, and bringing, opening up tourism product right throughout the South Island. I have benefited from sitting on the board with him, but also being in Middlemarch, seeing the difference that Tari Gorge has made in that time. Is very much community orientated, and moreover, it has given so many positive stories to the city. So I'd just like to move that vote of thanks, and without saying any more, but I know that Councillor Ben Superb, who I think takes some credit for the formation of the company in his previous term, may wish to add much more detail than myself.
Leaving aside, Your Worship, the role of the council honorary historian, I think it's important to thank Murray for the work he's done, and also appropriate to acknowledge that the reason that company exists now was because this council, or an earlier iteration of it, made the insightful and, thank goodness, made the insightful decision to purchase the track at the time that the government was going to lift, or the company was going to lift the rail and sleepers and sell them. And I think we've seen the benefit of that. It's not without a bit of hair tearing and finger biting, as the gentleman at the table recognised, that compared with some of our other operations, there are a number of very substantial threats, which we're constantly reminded of, in respect of the Tyree Gorge, not only the issues with the track itself and maintenance and health and safety issues, but the unstable topography, the tunnels, dare I say it, and the viaducts and plenty more. And we've recently seen the issues with land movement. But nonetheless, the existence of the train and its associated services elsewhere, and the continued existence of the track as far as Middlemarch, are a wonderful part of the quiver of activities available to our people and visitors to the city. And Mr Bond has played an enormous part in maintaining that at the break-even, close to, but nonetheless successful operating level that it has, and I think he should be thoroughly commended for that, and take our best wishes into his retirement, or whatever train he's going to ride on. Thank
you. Would anyone else like to speak to that? There being no one, that's a vote of thanks to Murray Bond. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Councillor Hawkins, did you have something to raise, or? No. So I'll move from the chair that we move into non-public for the reasons outlined on the agenda. Do I have a seconder for that? Second to Councillor Newell. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried.